Good morning. It's Thursday morning, Thursday, December 7th. You know, there are only a handful of events in our nation's history where, if you were alive, there were events where you know exactly where you were because they were that significant in our experience. Events like the Columbia disaster, the NASA's explosion of Columbia in the sky, taking the lives of the astronauts on board. Certainly 9/11, the terrorist attack. And then there's the assassination of John F. Kennedy. These were so significant that if you were alive at the time, you know exactly where you were. Today commemorates one such event, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Not many of us were alive, but it is, as President Roosevelt said at the time, it is a day that will live in infamy and does live in infamy because it's so significant. 80 years ago today, 183 Japanese planes attacked a military base of Pearl Harbor, leaving 4,403 Americans dead. I want to tell you a story about where God was on that day and in the days that followed. Because very often the darkest moments in our history, the darkest moments in our lives, leave us asking sometimes the question, where was God? The story begins with the leader of that Japanese attack named Mitsu Fushido. He was the one who was chosen by the emperor to lead the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had 10,000 missions under his belt, and he was not only the leader, but also the architect of the attack. After the attack was over, he examined the results of the attack, and he sent this message to the emperor: Tora, 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 which is a Japanese way of saying the attack was a success. Those words also were the inspiration for a movie about that attack called Tora, Tora, Tora. Well, after Pearl Harbor, Fushido went home and took up the life of farming, and of course, the United States eventually won the war. But the rest of the story of Mitsu Fushido shows that God was working, that God was there. Two stories that followed that attack changed Fushido's life. One story has to do with Peggy Covell. 4 years after the attack on Pearl Harbor, General John MacArthur summoned Fushido to testify at the criminal trials that were taking place in Tokyo. Fushido saw his flight engineer, during that attack. He saw him at the trials, and he was surprised to learn that his engineer, had become a prisoner of war in Japan following the war, where he was treated by an American named Peggy Covell, whose parents had been beheaded following the attack by the Japanese. Her parents were missionaries to the Philippines, and when Japan found them, they put them in custody. And before the beheading, Peggy's parents asked if they could have 30 minutes to pray for those who would behead them. And then they were beheaded. For a long while, Peggy was very angry, understandably, at the Japanese people. She herself was a missionary. But over time, God helped her to forgive her enemies. And she became a missionary in Japan. She cared for many POWs after the war, including Fushido's flight engineer. Bushido heard that story and he could not understand how someone could treat an enemy who had beheaded her parents with such compassion. Because the code of honor for Bushido was that you take vengeance upon the enemies who have disgraced, or in this case, taken the lives of your loved ones. However, this act of compassion didn't make sense. 4 years later, 8 years after Pearl Harbor, he was summoned to Tokyo again to testify at the war crimes trial. And it was there where a leaflet was passed to him by a Westerner that told the story of Jacob de Chazer. Jacob de Chazer was one of the Doolittle Raiders, a group of pilots led by Jimmy Doolittle during World War II, who had bombed Tokyo and other parts of Japan after Pearl Harbor. De Chazer and 8 others were captured, put in a POW camp. He was one of only 3 who survived that time as a prisoner. De Chazer was there, very, very angry toward the Japanese. He was there for 40 months, 26 of them in solitary confinement. And when the rules eased up a little bit and they were given better things to eat, they were also given books to read. And he asked to have a Bible because he was curious to know what these Christians saw in this person called Jesus. So with plenty of time on his hands, he took a Bible. He was allowed to have it for 3 weeks, and he read through the Bible, and he came to accept Jesus as his Savior. And when he was released, when they were liberated, he became himself an evangelist. And he went back to Japan, and he planted a church in one of the cities that he had bombed. Bushido heard the story of Peggy Covell. He read the story of Jacob de Chazer. And 10 years later, he accepted Jesus as his Savior. He had bought a Bible. He had read it through. And when he came to Luke chapter 23 and the words of Jesus on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," he just broke down in tears. And he accepted Jesus as his personal Savior. And Mitsu Bushido became a Christian evangelist, not only in Japan, but in the United States. What a story of what God was doing. Where was God in Pearl Harbor? Certainly, God wasn't responsible for that terrible event. God is not responsible for the bad things that happen because of the sin of men. But where is God when those things happen? The answer is Emmanuel. God is with us. You can read and see an interview with these 2 men, Mitsu Bushido and Jacob de Chazer, on the Flock Note this morning. But just remember, in the most difficult times of your life, in the darkest moments of your life, when you are tempted to ask, where is God? Emmanuel is the answer. God is with us always. Have a wonderful Thursday. Merry Christmas.